Well, as I mentioned before, we human beings live by the stories. We are a language-driven species, and we frame our experience in terms of stories we tell back and forth to each other, narratives through history. And we're now in urgent need of a new narrative because the human race is nearing potential extinction with climate change and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. For the last 200 years, we've lived off the ideas of the Enlightenment that were spawned at the very beginning of the market era, nation-state era, in the 18th and 19th century. And the Enlightenment philosophers believed that human beings were born to seek autonomy and their material self-interest, that we are rational, calculating, objective, that we are aggressive, even predatory, that we are utilitarian, that we are pleasure-seeking beings. That was the idea of what human nature was, and it was embedded in our parenting, in our school systems, in our governance, and our business practices. Think of geopolitics as an extension of that idea. Nation states are like individuals. They compete with each other, both in terms of economic competition and sometimes in terms of conquest, in order to create their own autonomous, self-interested beings. So if we have a world where we think that's our human nature, we end up making that our nature. What I'm saying is that what we're discovering in neurocognitive science and evolutionary scientific research is human beings are not born to seek materialism and self-interest and utility and aggression. We are born to seek intimacy and companionship and affection, and our scientists are discovering that we're actually soft-wired for empathic expression, and that is to experience the other as if we are experiencing ourselves. So if we are really homo empathicus, that's our soft-wired nature, how do we nurture that institutionally so we become an empathic civilization? Because if we're going to try to bring the human race together to deal with climate change and create a new economic paradigm to save this planet, we can't think of 6.8 billion cowboys each pursuing their own materialistic, aggressive self-interest. If we are homo empathicus and by nature empathic, then we have to find a way to rethink culturally our parenting, our schooling, our business and government models so that we can nurture those basic drives, so that we begin to think of our fellow human beings as part of our single family. We empathize across the entire human race, and even equally important, begin to think of our fellow creatures as fellow extended evolutionary family, and we empathize with their experience. If we can extend empathy to our fellow human beings and our fellow creatures as one extended family, we create biosphere consciousness. We begin to realize that everything we do intimately affects everyone else on this planet. Not just our carbon footprint, but everything. And if we can begin to think in terms of biosphere politics and biosphere consciousness, we may be able to save ourselves and learn how to live on this planet with our fellow creatures. We're not doing a good job of it right now. So I think, you have one more?
If possible, you also spoke that still cultural policies and education policies are quite weak in this global talk. How do you see them embedded into this global conversation from now on, facing the global challenges and the needs of policy?
That's a good question. I think it's an important question. I think that the analogy I use here is 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. 25 years ago, there was no such thing as environmental ministers. They didn't exist. 10 years ago, they existed, but they were the least important ministers in the cabinet of every country. Today, the environmental ministers are right at the table, and their role is as important as the economic ministers and the finance ministers, because we now realize that environmental issues are now critical to our survival on this planet. We now have to realize that to attend to these environmental issues, especially climate change, we need to begin to have a great global cultural discussion on rethinking human nature and the mission of the human journey. And that means that our cultural ministers and educational ministers have to come from the side of the room to the center of the room and take on an importance at the table, just like the environmental ministers did over the last decade. Because if we're going to rethink the cultural narrative and rethink the way we understand education, those two ministers in every country are going to be the most important, because they'll help us facilitate conversations regionally and globally around how we come together and think of ourselves as homo empathicus and how we prepare for an empathic civilization, and so that we can address climate change and hopefully survive and prosper in the coming centuries.
sounds like a new prophecy for a new European narrative. Thank you very
Hopefully.
much.
Thank you very much.